Right, and we can go full screen and everything, but I probably won't. So, React State. So on Tuesday, state was one of the new kind of vocabulary words that that are introduced with React. There's components, there's state, there's props, and I can't remember which was the fourth one that I included. Possibly hooks. So today we're going to look at that first one. We're going to look at state. We are also going to be using props and hooks, but and components, but we are going to focus on state, and as such we're not really going to be creating too many, well, we'll see how it goes, but we're not going to be creating too many additional components. We're just going to store some state. We're going to maybe mostly update it using the React dev tools, and update the page that way. We'll see how we get on. Also, this lesson, there's not a huge number of slides, and so it's probably going to be fairly code heavy. And when it is code heavy, or whenever I'm coding, I know everyone likes to just sit there in silence, and you're probably actually at the pub or something, and you're just turning up, and so your name shows up on the list. But when there's lots of coding in a lesson, I do much prefer it if there is some kind of input from you guys. So you don't necessarily have to kind of unmute and shout things out, but it would be nice if the thing that we build, it's kind of going to be recipe based, the thing that we build, you could suggest some features for it as we go, and we can go from there. So, state, it's a place to store your variables. When state changes, your app renders again with those new values. So you have a string that you're storing inside state. That's basically a variable. And when that string changes, so the user's on their sort of profile page, they choose to update their username, they click save, and that tells state, okay, the username that the user's storing has now changed. That, wherever it's being displayed on the page, will automatically update, because React knows when something changes in your state, it knows to update the page at the same time. That's the whole idea of state. There are two ways to do it. So we're going to look at functional components first, and these use hooks. This is kind of the more modern way of writing React, only by about two years, maybe 18 months, but that's a long time in web development years. So if you were to go into an interview and you were asked to write some React code, I would say that they'd probably expect you to write functional components and using hooks. I don't think it's a problem if you write classes, but it's generally the more modern way of writing React code. But we are also going to look at classes, partly because I think it's easier to understand. With functional components and hooks, I've had some really infuriating bugs that I know wouldn't occur if I was using classes. That could just be my fault. but I also generally think it's a little bit easier to understand. But we're going to do functions and hooks first, because that's primarily how you're going to write your React code. So useState. useState is a hook. All of the hooks that React provides, and you can write your own hooks, start with the term use. So useState is saying we want to use this feature of React, we want to use the state feature, and this line, there's quite a lot going on here. So useState returns an array with 2 elements in it. And rather than storing the array and then accessing the first element and the second element all the time, or doing anything else, we immediately destructure the array and assign the value of the first element to the word counter, and assign the value of the second element to the word set counter. So what useState returns is a getter and a setter, essentially. So counter is actually just a number. In our case, it's a number. We pass through an initial value to useState. So we want to say, create some piece of state somewhere, a variable somewhere in the hidden React code that starts with a value of 0. The first time we access this counter, the first time our component renders, counter is going to be 0. Set counter is a function. That function takes an argument of the new value that we want counter to have. So in this code, we create some state called counter, and we have our setter called set counter. Then we kind of immediately call the function set counter and set it to counter +1. So every time we call this, we're going to increase that counter, and we're returning some JSX, which is going to be just a div element that displays the current value of counter. So every time set counter is called, it changes state, and therefore React goes, okay, state has changed, something has changed, so I need to re-render. So it's going to automatically display the new value of counter. So it's sort of simple, right? We call useState, we say, please store this value for me. I'm going to name the value something like counter, and usually the second argument you're going to call set, then whatever the name you've given it here. It is always a function that is used to update the value stored in state and referenced by this name. Every time we call it, it sets counter to whatever counter is right now, +1, and we update the DOM to view the new counter value. We'll try this exact thing a little bit later, and you can see what's going on, and you can see why this exact code is wrong. In fact, I think React just won't even let you run this. But it's kind of talking through it in steps. Okay, right. That was, yeah, fine. This changes state, so re-render. Whenever this is called, we re-render. That's really important. Oh, I looked through these slides earlier and I totally missed this one. Okay, right. I've done right. I've already done that because I totally missed this slide. Okay, and it's called My Excellent App here, but I called it Cracking Recipes. So that didn't quite go exactly to plan. Code cracking recipes. Has anyone run crack recipes? Crack, that would be a very different website, and we'd certainly get we'd get banned from all sorts of places. Google would probably still let us if we paid them. Has anyone run Create React App since Tuesday? I kind of chucked it in at the end and said it's really important. I can't imagine anyone has actually run it yet, so I'll talk you through what it generates. And there's kind of quite a lot to it. So it starts off, every kind of modern JavaScript project, the first thing you want to look at is package.json. So it's got these dependencies, which actually there's not a huge amount of dependencies here. We have React DOM, because actually there is a native app version of React as well called React Native, and the idea is you can write code that works in the browser and as a native mobile app. The reality is not really like that. So there's actually two libraries that we need. We need React and React DOM, and then there's React scripts, which you can see it's kind of highlighting here. These are the scripts, the NPM commands that we have available to us, and they are actually all just running scripts that are in the React scripts dependency that's somewhere buried in our node modules. So npm start, that is almost always the first thing you want to run, because it's already, it's opened it down here, that's not very helpful. It's already installed the dependencies. So this is the first page you get when you run Create React App. And I admittedly haven't run Create React App for quite a long time, and they used to have this rotating, animating React logo. Then they got rid of it with just like a static logo, and I was really disappointed, so I'm glad to see that they brought back the animating logo. So this is what you get. It says edit source app.js and save to reload. So all of this is running using Webpack, and if we do something in app, let's get rid of edit that. We hit save, and it just instantly updates, or more or less instantly. So this is why Create React App is really good, because it sets up the entire pipeline for you. The other things in package.json to build. So right now we're like running a server, running a developer server. It's not optimized. If you want to build your version to deploy to a URL that you've purchased, you run build. If you want to run the tests, you run test. I can't actually remember what eject does, but it basically, I think, sort of packages up all the node modules or something like that. It kind of builds a static version. I can't quite remember. So it gives you more than you will probably need initially. And so it's said to edit app.js, but app.js is not actually the entry point. Index is the entry point of this React app. Index is generally the entry point of pretty much any project. And let's have a look at what this is doing. React strict mode, I don't really know why they have that. And my I'm not saving on save, format on save, yes, great. Okay, so we import React, we import React DOM. Again, that's because we are building stuff for the browser, so the DOM, the document object model, so React to work in the browser, that's what React DOM is. We import the CSS file. In fact, we've looked at Webpack with you. Have we looked at Webpack, or have you just been like including JavaScript files in an HTML file? I think we did. Mushtaq says so. This syntax, import React DOM from React DOM. Does that look familiar? Yes, Mushtaq says yes. Okay. So if you remember require from Node or anything like that, it's more or less the same. It's kind of a more modern version of that. And because it's modern, it is written in a fairly easy to understand way. So import React DOM from React DOM. This is the name of a dependency in Node modules. Import ./index.css. So that means also load up this index CSS file. Import app. So app is being exported from app.js. And here the service worker. So this is something that is quite cool that they include it, but it's really overkill to just like chuck together a little prototype project. Actually, oh yeah, one thing that I quite like to do is if we get info on this and size, just to show you, that is 266 meg. When it's all compiled and you build it and deploy it, it's probably going to be half a meg or even smaller than that. So modern JavaScript development is pretty crazy, and it's all because of these node modules. So that's why Create React App gets a bit of a bad name. But one thing it does include, which is super cool, is the service worker. So again, you don't need to worry about it, but there is a PWA. There is a type of website, I suppose. Oh, brilliant. Okay, that's not really what I wanted. Okay, whatever, PWA. There is a type of website, I suppose, called a progressive web app, or a PWA. And I use the Twitter PWA. I can't remember. I use some PWAs. If you've ever been on a website, generally on your phone, but these days, in fact, on desktop as well, it sometimes pops up at the bottom to say, I don't know, install Twitter to your device. And that's because the Twitter website is a PWA. And PWAs feel like native apps. That's the idea, to kind of blur the lines between a website and a native app. So they work offline, create an offline fallback page. So rather than showing this kind of no internet default page in Chrome or Safari or whatever, this is what Trivago shows when you're offline. So you've actually downloaded all of the files to run this website onto your machine. So when it's when you don't have any network connection and you try to access that website, it can still run on your machine. It can't make any requests to its API, so it decides to show you this offline screen, which is kind of the same if you open an app and you don't have any network. You can still open the app, you just can't really see anything. So it's blurring the lines between websites and native apps. And Create React App includes a service worker that does kind of all of that offline stuff for you, or sort of some of the offline stuff for you. This is a bit of a tangent. We're not really talking about PWAs today, but I just think it's a really nice process to go through. So PWA, the reason I encourage people to kind of build their websites as PWAs is because the process is so nice. You just run that test. You go to Lighthouse in DevTools, you run a test, and it goes, current page does not respond with 200, learn more. Here's a link to do that. Start URL does not respond with 200, that's the same one, so learn more. Here's a link to do that, to pass that test. And look, by default, Create React App actually has most of these passing. So PWAs are really nice. They make it really nice for the user, and the process of building, of kind of getting a website to become a PWA is really nice. It's really good. You can do it in, I don't know, half an hour potentially. Anyway, so that's a bit of an aside. It's something that Create React App includes for you. You don't really have to worry. But this line is kind of where everything kicks off. This is the entry point of our entire app. So our whole app is a component called app. We are saying to React DOM, please render some JSX into a DOM element that we've got using our traditional query selector, get element by ID, whatever we want to do. So we say React DOM, render some JSX into the element with the ID root. If we look in public, so these are the kind of static files that get, it's not really true, but these are kind of the static files that get served with your website. So there's kind of big logos and stuff. You need these for the PWA. You need the manifest for the PWA, robots as well. But here's the index. So this is best practice. This is good stuff to have. This is best practice. So it has all of this in there for you. Theme, color, description, all of this. There's some comments in here kind of telling you what to do. And here is our div with the ID root. We can add stuff in here if we want to, but now we're using React. We pretty much just need this one element, and our entire app gets injected into that element. We can have whatever we want in here, as long as it's JSX. And now we get a page that just says hello, but we want our one entry point, the top of that component tree, to be rendered into our root component, which is our app. So, well, our root element, sorry. Okay, so that's kind of explaining all of Create React App, but we're here to talk about state. So I'm going to get rid of some of this. Sorry, nice spinning logo. Get rid of that. And crackers. So this is going to be our header. Crackers. These are egg recipes. I think on the next slide, I saw the next slide, but I didn't see that slide. Okay, I totally missed loads. Anyway, recipes.js. Can I just do export default? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure these are all going to be all full recipes. Import recipes from recipes. So we've got those recipes. I'm going to say original recipes, something along those lines. And inside the app, we're going to have recipes. We're going to have recipes and set recipes. We're going to import useState. VS Code has done that nicely and automatically. And the initial value of recipes is actually going to be original recipes. Now this, you're probably going to get from an API. We could kind of fake it if we want, but for today, let's keep it relatively simple. And we're hard coding these recipes over here in this file, importing them here, and we're just going to use that as the initial value of recipes. So we're not really doing anything with it yet, but if we go over to React DevTools, we look at the app component, and we can see we have this section called hooks. It lists all of the pieces of state in that component. Or, well, hooks lists all of the hooks we're using. Because we are using useState, it lists this piece of state, which is right now 10 recipes, 10 egg-based recipes. Let's have a title. Let's have a set title. Let's have it a little bit simpler. Title, and then let's ignore set title for now. Okay. So now, as soon as I type anything in here, egg-based things, hit enter, that calls set state, or in this case, it actually calls set title, or the same function. It calls set title and updates that piece of state that we're storing there. Now what we could do, we can pass an on-click prop to that H1 element, and when we click on that element, we're going to set the title to, I don't know, the current title plus or cool plus the current title. So crackers, we're now going to click on that header, and it's setting the new value of title to cool plus whatever the current value of title is, and we re-render, which actually calls this function again. So we're calling useState again, we're calling useState again, and we're actually creating all of these variables every single time. But behind the scenes, React knows the order in which you've called these hooks, and so it remembers what actually the current state of title is and the current state of recipes is, and it kind of ignores this initial value and gives you the current value, which slightly blows my mind a little bit, and which is why I find functional components and hooks just a little bit more complicated than class components, which we'll look at later. But it's super clever stuff. So every time I click on that, it's taking the current value and adding something to that. So we can call that, and that's all we're doing. We're just updating a string. And that, I hope you can see why it's really nice to work with React. Even if you set up a relatively nice function to update that title in vanilla JavaScript, that function, you would have to set that up. You would have to, I don't know, update the value, the variable that you're storing somewhere, and update the element in the page. And that's two things that you want to do. Whereas here, it's just updating that value. It seems like it's nothing, that it's halving the number of things that you need to do, but it makes it really, really nice. So let's also have, I don't know, let's have, there are recipes.length, egg-based recipes available. There are 10 egg-based recipes available. So we're taking whatever the current length of this array is, and I'm assuming I can hit delete on one of these, and even before this is updated, the page has updated to 9. I'm going to click it again. I'm going to click now. That updates immediately, and that updates like half a second later, because they kind of deprioritize updating the dev tools and make sure the website is updating as quickly as possible. So let's have a button, add a new one, and on click. Now here, rather than having this inline function, which is not great practice, occasionally having an inline function like this in the onClick handler to set a piece of state, occasionally it's okay, but generally you want to do this. Add new recipe is a function that we create up here inside this app component, and we say on click use this function. So we're going to pass this function as a reference to this button, and when we click on it, this function is going to be called. So recipes.push, nope, set recipes. So we don't do recipes.push. That is not going to tell React that we have changed the state. The only way to tell React that we've changed the state and therefore re-render is by calling set recipes. So we're going to call set recipes with all of the current recipes plus a new one that, okay, it even tells us title omelette, ingredients, egg, thumbnail, egg.png, and is that it? Title href, eggs.com. Okay, so I'm going to add a new one. We should see this number increase by 1, and in fact every single time I am increasing that number because our state should now have loads and loads of just plain old omelettes. Now, what could we do? What time is it? It is 10 to 7. Okay. So now, before we get to displaying all of these recipes, which we'll do, we'll probably do later, I think, after we've refactored to a class component. But what if we only want to add it once? And we don't want to display this button once we've added that new recipe. There's a few different ways we can do that, but the most kind of easy to understand one, I think, is we're going to have new recipe added and set new recipe added use state. This is going to be a Boolean that starts as false. We have not yet added our new recipe. So in this function call, add new recipe, we call set recipes with this new array of the existing recipes plus our omelette recipe. And we also are going to set new recipe added to true. Then down here, we can write some, we can write an expression. So in JavaScript, you have sort of statements and expressions, and it just think of it as like simple stuff. So inside the JSX, where we have our JavaScript, we can write ternaries. So what have we called it? New recipe added. Then you already added the omelette. Otherwise, we show that button that we had before. And the sort of auto formatting that I have, I'm using Prettier. It always likes to add extra parentheses around these, but I think this is the easiest to read when it's like this. So if the new recipe is added, then show this div, this message, otherwise show the button. So I save it, it formats and it adds these parentheses. It splits it onto multiple lines, which is nice, but I think the parentheses are a bit unnecessary. So now, as soon as we add a new one, there are 11 egg-based recipes, and we already added the omelette because that piece of state has now set to true. If you see over here, React DevTools knows it's a Boolean. You're probably only going to want to toggle it between true and false, so it gives us a checkbox to do that easily. If I check that to false, this button becomes available again. I can click it, it changes it to true eventually. Why is that not set to true? Add new recipe, set new recipe added true. I'm assuming that's not actually correct. Add a new one. You already added the omelette. 13. Really? Okay, well now I think, that makes absolutely no sense. It's like the simplest thing ever. Now's a good time, I think, to refactor to a class component. Because I reckon this is one of those things that hooks causes an issue with. So, state is local to a component. Right now, we only really have one component. So our app component is storing all of the state in our app. But each component can have its own state. So we could, and I think we might later on, we're going to display all those recipes, and that could be a component called recipe list. And that could have the button to add the recipe to the list, and that could store the state of whether or not the button was clicked inside that component. We'll have a look at that a bit later. But one important thing be aware of is that state can be passed down the hierarchy, but not up. So if app was rendering a component called recipe list, a piece of state that is stored in app, for example, the array of recipes, could be passed down to the recipe list component. But if the recipe list component was storing if a new recipe has been added, that piece of state cannot be passed up to the parent. So that's something that comes with a little bit of time to kind of realize exactly when you should have local state, or when you think you're going to need to pass it to other components. And there's this phrase of lifting state up. So if you actually have state in a child component, and then you realize later on that you need it in the parent component, you do this kind of refactoring process of lifting the state up from the child component into the parent component. So props is going to be a whole lesson just on props and passing state as props, and that's all going to come next week. But it is a really important point while we're talking about state that we can pass it down the hierarchy but not up. Okay, I suppose before we refactor, you know what I'm going to say, any questions? But actually, what I've started doing in these slides is saying 3 questions, please. So we're not going to move on until I get 3 questions. For you, I'm going to reduce that to 2 because I know you just sit there in silence, and there's only 4 of you anyway. So we're not going to move on until I've had 2 questions. Hello, Dan. You unmuted and then I couldn't hear you, but I don't know if that's my fault or you just got nervous. Oh, and it's not charging. My Mac's not charging. Great. Mushtaq.
Yes, I just want to understand a little bit more about the state. So the state storage is the variable.
Yes.
Can we say state is the variable in sense of JavaScript, or it's not?
I would try to think of state as a place to store your variables. So if we want to talk about kind of equivalence, if we have title is a string and recipes is an array and has added new recipe is a boolean, these are variables and they're all stored I don't know, kind of globally or within the file, depending on how your JavaScript is kind of put together.
Mm-hmm.
But the equivalent now is kind of like having one object with these 3 values stored inside it. So it's a pretty small difference, but we are storing these variables inside an object that looks like this. And again, when we now look at class components and we refactor it a little bit, this is exactly how state is written in class components, and that's another reason why I find it easier to explain, easier to understand, because this is not particularly easy to read and realize what's going on. But this, you're just going, oh right, instead of storing them as their own variables, they're just variables that are being stored on this one object.
I see. That makes more clear. Okay.
Cool. Dan, you unmuted. I mean, you gotta come forward with the question.
Oh no, I think I plugged in something, took out something and plugged it back. So that's
well, you've fallen for my trap. You've unmuted now. Give me a question.
Does it have to be React related?
I mean, I suppose you can ask me what I think of Jose Mourinho's performance as a Spurs manager, but I don't think anyone else wants to hear about that.
I don't really have anything at the moment, to be honest.
Okay, fine. I'll let you all off because it's painful. So we'll look at class components now, and I think, yeah, like I said earlier, they're kind of old-fashioned. They're the old-fashioned way of writing React code, but I think even if we did do some object-oriented code, maybe sort of 2 lessons on that, but so you're probably all not very comfortable with it, but you don't really use it in the same way in React. It's just how you define them. You define them as classes instead of functions, but they still end up being in JSX. So it's not strictly object-oriented code as we looked at it a few weeks ago. So hooks are a new feature of React, and everyone went crazy and oh, they're the best thing ever. But I mean, I think nowadays if you talk to people, they'll go, well, a kind of mix is probably best. Before this, only classes existed, sort of. Hooks are probably what I mean, they are what you should focus on. They are what the exercises all focus on. They're what we'll be doing from now on. But classes are simpler to understand. So today and maybe Tuesday, I can't remember, we'll be showing class components as well. So class recipe list extends React component. So if we think back to object-oriented programming, we have inheritance. We have a class called recipe list that extends or inherits from React.component. So everything that React.component has, our recipe list now has. And actually that's quite a lot of stuff. The vast majority of it we don't really care about, but there is a lot of stuff going on there. But we, just to get something to display, we actually only need this function. We need a render function. So when this component gets rendered, this is what it should display. That's fairly easy to understand. I think it's fairly easy to understand, and it's why class components make sense to me. Another reason why it makes sense is because this is how you declare the state that this component stores. So it's no longer useState or like recipes, set recipes, useState, array, only simple, set only simple, useState, false. It's an object that represents the state of the component. I think that's 100 times easier to understand. I mean, you're the ones learning it, so do tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this really makes a lot more sense. So that's the kind of most basic structure of a class component with some state with a function to display some JSX. To get access to that piece of state, we have only simple a Boolean in there. We use this. So if you think back to object-oriented, if you want to access itself, if you want to access, I don't know what we did a nurse, we did a nurse. If the nurse wants to access something on that nurse, it has to use the keyword this. So this dot state is that object, is the current version of that object. This dot state dot only simple is then false or true, or in fact anything. We can set it to anything, but it's just an object. This dot state is just an object, and then we can access any of the keys on there. To update the state, it's still a function. So we call this dot set state, and we pass it all of the key value pairs that we want to update. All the other keys stay the same. So if we were to do this, if we had a function that calls set state and we set only simple to true, we wouldn't then lose the current state of recipes. It would keep the current state of recipes. It only overwrites the value of the only simple key, the keys that we've included in this object. And that's it. So right now on these slides, it might not be super clear about how this all fits together, but now we'll refactor. In fact, I think I will have a recipe list just so we can have app and recipe list. And maybe recipe list could store the recipes itself rather than receive them as from app, because that is getting into props and that's going to be Tuesday. So we're going to create a new file, class recipe list extends react.component, and then the thing that I always forget to do, export default recipe list, and that's it. React, can you import that please? No. Come on, VS Code, why is it not doing that? Whatever. Okay, extend react.component, we're there. So here we're going to have a state object, recipes. Let's start it as an empty array. And render, it's going to be a method that has, I don't know, a class name, because class is a keyword that we use up here. So it's always class name, recipes, something like that. There are this.state.recipes.length recipes. Okay, so we come over here. Get rid of that stuff. Let's get rid of that. And now we're going to display recipe list. So we've defined our recipe list in our other file. We've imported that file and we're displaying that component inside our JSX. component is a class. It has a render function. This is what we're going to display. This is the current state. Right now there are no recipes. Let's now import original recipes, and let's say, no, that's not going to work. Recipes is going to start as original recipes. So now there are 10 recipes. Another benefit of class components. Title, let's just do silly stuff. A name, age, location, set name, set age, location, whatever. So clearly these values aren't right. The title of the web page is crackers, okay, but then this is also crackers, so that's like not wrong. That should be some kind of name, and then this one, that should be some kind of age, and then that should be some kind of location. But because we aren't using keys on an object, we can't actually figure out what the name of a variable is. These names are only human readable. They're not computer readable. Whereas keys on an object are just strings, and so the computer can print out this list of strings in an object. Therefore, we go from this, the list of hooks, and these are all the state hooks that we're using. Here, the recipe list, the class component, has a state object with a key of recipes. So much nicer. So if we add name crackers, so clearly the values are still wrong, but at least I actually know what they should be. I know what they're all referring to: age, location, and name. It's so much better. That, honestly, because the dev tools are such an important part of being a React developer, I think the fact that you lose that descriptive name of state, I think it seems like nothing, but honestly, it's a massive benefit of using class components. And you could potentially get around it by just having, whatever. I can't be bothered to talk about that. But honestly, that you will learn to love these dev tools. They're really very useful. So recipe list now has its own state. It's not displaying any recipes yet, but to display components for each recipe, what we kind of want to end up with a recipe. So we're going to have in curly brackets this.state.recipes 0.title, although maybe this whole one can be an href this.state.recipes 0.href, and then image source this.state.recipes 0.thumbnail, and okay. Clearly it looks awful, but Let's do this so we don't want to target blank, because I'm going to click on those and inevitably have to open them in new tabs. We want one of these for each recipe. Now, it's clearly not, this is obviously not good code. Occasionally you might want the very first element of something, but what if there isn't a first element? Then we get an error. Cannot read property href of undefined, because it's got to this line and it said, okay, I'm going to access the first element in my recipes array, get the href from it, and there isn't anything in the array, therefore this is undefined. So we want this, but for every recipe in the array. So we're going to have some curly brackets. This .state.recipes is an array. We want to map over that array. And for every recipe in that array, we're going to have this callback function run, and we're going to return, instead of this state recipe 0, we're going to have recipe.href. So for every recipe in the array of recipes, give me one of these. So this is going to result in an array of JSX elements, but luckily React knows what to do with an array of JSX elements, and it displays them correctly. It looks pretty bad. Let's see. So we've got recipe. Let's see if we can do recipe border top is black solid 1px margin top. No, that didn't do anything. Class recipe. Why has that not done anything? Oh, because it's an A and we need to, oh right. It's an anchor tag and it displays some other way. How does it display? A, I don't know. Okay, so it still looks pretty bad, but at least they're all kind of separate. It looks really bad, doesn't it? You can suggest stuff later on. I've also realised my laptop isn't charging, and I don't entirely know what to do about that. Oh yeah, I do. Plug it in is the answer. The screen, I think, for some reason just went black, but it looks like I'm still recording. It looks like you can still see the screen, I think, but let me know if you can't see it. Okay, so we've got our recipes. We are displaying a recipe, a thing. We're displaying all the details for every recipe. Now, next week, you'll do something similar, but each of these will actually be its own recipe component. But we're going to stick just in recipe list for today. So, oh yeah, that's what I did in the slides. We had only simple. So what we can do. We can have only simple. It starts as false. We're going to have a little toggle, a little checkbox to filter recipes with greater than 5 ingredients or something along those lines. Also, we've got these warnings, which makes it pretty nice. These are warnings, so you don't really have to fix them for it to work, but they're encouraging you to build better websites. So it's certainly good to follow them, and it just means you result in a nicer console. So rel. Okay, now we've got the nice green compiled successfully. There's also another error in the console, but we can talk about that another time. Okay, we're doing only simple. So I've added this only simple state. There are this state recipes, length recipes, so it's showing 10 recipes and showing all 10 below. So before that, show only. We're going to have an input with the type checkbox, and I want to be able to toggle this on and off, and it will, oh, I forgot about that, and it will change the recipes that are displaying. So we can set the value of that input field to, actually it might be checked. Let's try this dot state dot only simple. So if I go over to my components, find my recipe list, we have the only simple state, and I can toggle that to true. Yeah, okay, it's not value, it's checked. The checked status of that checkbox is now, I'm clicking on the dev tools, I'm clicking over here, and it's now linked to this checkbox. So when the state only simple is true, that checkbox displays a check, and when the state only simple is false, that checkbox doesn't display anything. If I click on the checkbox, nothing happens. Because I click on the box, the click event fires, the change event fires, the browser goes, oh, the user has clicked on an input field, so please try to change the check status of that input field. But React kind of steps in and goes, no, because this checkbox must always be showing the same checked status as this value that I have here. So it doesn't allow us to change it now that we have linked it to our state. So what we have to do is on change this dot set state only simple, the opposite of this dot state dot only simple. So when the value of this changes, or when the checked status changes, it might actually be on click that we want to do, but we'll try it. Set the state, but only the only simple key. We're going to leave the recipes key as it is. Set the only simple state to the opposite of whatever it currently is. So we have the exclamation mark before it. It's a Boolean. It should just toggle between the two. Perfect. That is now responding to my input as a user, and we can see it's updating over here, and I can uncheck this, and it's now also responding to my input as a developer. So if, for example, I had like 10 of these checkboxes, I could add one button at the bottom that just sets all 10 of those values to false, to like reset all of those checkboxes. And you just have to set all those values to false and all the checkboxes will clear. It's a really nice way of like resetting a form or kind of, doing stuff like that. So now we have some way for our user to toggle only the simple recipes. We now need to say, if this.state.onlySimple, if we should only show the simple recipes, then filter out of this array all of the complicated recipes. So the way that you would have done this in vanilla JavaScript is inside this change function, or when the user clicks on that checkbox, you will probably kind of update an array. You'll filter over the recipes array, maybe you'll update this recipes array, and then you'll say update the page with this new set of recipes. This is actually all we want to store in state. We don't want to store a duplicate array of simple recipes or recipes to display, or we don't even want to change the recipes that we're storing in state. I'll show you why we don't want to do that in a bit. I'll show you that now. So toggle simple recipes. This is the sort of function that you might have in vanilla JavaScript. This dot toggle simple recipes, and we're going to have new only simple value is the opposite of this dot state dot only simple. In fact, we can just call it only simple. So if only simple, we're going to say this dot set state recipes is going to be this dot state dot recipes dot filter, and we want to return recipe dot ingredients dot split. It's just a string, so we're splitting by comma space dot length is greater than is less than 5. So if the number of ingredients in the recipe is less than 5, then keep it in our recipes array. Else, in fact, I don't know, this dot state dot recipes, we don't really have to do anything, but let's kind of leave it there for sort of clarity. We're also setting the new only simple value, and because the key is the same as the name of this variable, we can use the shorthand. I'm going to do it again for clarity. So here, only simple, without the colon, with the key value pair, we combining them sets the key of only simple to the value of only simple. Here it's the same thing. It's just shorthand. So whenever I click on it, I am going to filter out any complicated recipes or not. So let's have a go at that. Show only the simple ones, check. There are no recipes, great. Really? 1, 2, 3, okay, right, they're all, because they all include salt and black pepper and olive oil, like, that's standard, isn't it? He's gonna, come on. Okay. I don't know where I got these omelette recipes from, by the way. That I didn't write them all myself. So we're now only showing the simple ones. So that was fairly straightforward. We just update the array in state, and React goes, okay, you've updated state. There's now only 4 recipes, so I'm now only going to show 4 recipes. But now I'm going to uncheck this, and I want to see all of them again. Nothing changes. They don't come back. We have removed those other 6 recipes from this array. So what you might think, okay, well, let's keep recipes and have a separate array of simple recipes or something along those lines. But again, what if you've got 10 different checkboxes? You've got a search field, you've got all sorts of search, sort, and filter options. With React, you want to store the simplest version of the data that can be computed to show the end result to the user. So in this case, we want to store the full array of recipes and this only simple true false boolean. We don't want to store anything else. Based on these 2 things, every single time this renders, we can figure out if we should show the simple recipes or the complicated recipes. So all of this actually just goes back to not changing the recipes, only changing that only simple value. So it's kind of overkill, but I'll leave it like that for clarity. Now the difference is we work out what to display just before we render. So in the top of the render function, recipes to display is going to be, we can have this.state.simple, only simple. We can filter them, this.state.recipes.filter. Oh, I just did that and deleted it. Recipe.ingredients.split. Length is less than 9. Otherwise, just all the recipes. So we're never changing the recipes that we're storing in state. We're only kind of storing a temporary variable that we then use in these 2 places. And based on the current value of that only simple toggle, we're just gonna kind of temporarily filter them, or we just show the whole entire list of recipes. So now I can toggle it. There's only 4. We look in state. Only simple is true. Recipes still has 10 in it. So when I uncheck that, React sees that something's changed because we've changed state here. So it calls render again, and render figures out based on the current values in our state what we should display. So that is another kind of mindset shift. You're used to kind of the key moment being when the user clicks. And actually in React, it kind of doesn't really become when the user clicks. It's when it renders. When it renders is when you determine what you should be displaying. Oh, I thought I was going to sneeze. That is a really important part that takes a little bit of time to get used to. But hopefully you'll get there. I reckon now it's time for you to suggest some features. So we can add some kind of a sort type. We can sort by, I don't know, alphabetically in the title. We can sort by the number of ingredients. We can have this show only the simple ones. We can have this being kind of dynamic. We can have a text box where we type in 9 or 11 or whatever we want our sort of simple ingredient threshold. We could have a whole form to add a new recipe. That's a bit of a faff, but we can do it. Although state, let's look at more props and state. Okay, I think then that's kind of when the form comes into it. Fetching user effect router, yeah. So we can do a form, but it's a little bit of a faff, and you will cover forms in much more detail later on. Features for this. Anything. No, nothing. Oh, coming up with ideas for features is the hardest part, not the coding of it. I think let's refactor and then 3 questions please. That is the end of the slides, so it is more coding time. But what do we want to build? Let's do actually no, let's not add anything to this. Let's go back up into app, and there's quite a common sort of React intro exercise, and I don't think I'll be able to find it, but it's basically, we can do it with the title. It's basically having an input field, and whatever I type into the input field becomes the title. Just it's linked. The two are linked to whatever is in state, and they're both updating in real time. We'll do that initially, and then maybe we can kind of go from there and add a sort of search function to this list. So we've got the title. We can have something like default title is default title. So that's going to be crackers, and we'll kind of revert back to that if if the user hasn't typed anything in. So let's say title.length is 0, then actually go kind of outside of the state, outside of the function, to this sort of hard-coded default title. Otherwise, we do want to display a title. And we can keep this on click here just for fun. And now handle input change. So on change of this input field, and again, that is something that, oh, I don't know if I could actually hear you. I'm going to guess that no one had said anything, but I think my speakers had turned off. But I can be quite confident in the assumption that no one did say anything, and maybe they've been turned off for an hour and a half, who knows. Anyway, so if you think back to when you were first learning events, and on an input field like this, the change event is actually when you're typing and then you kind of lose focus of that input field. You click off or you tab or whatever. So you're typing, there's no change event firing, then you go to the next one, and then that's when the change event fires. In React, they have gone with on change for the input event. So as I'm typing, the input event is firing for all of those characters that I've just done. I've just typed. And I think change makes more sense than input. Input is not really a verb. I know that's a lie, I suppose it is. But for me, this makes way more sense. On change, they've decided is actually going to be referring to the input event. So on change, call the function handle input change. So we can look in the console. You can see if I group similar, ungroup similar, every time I type, input change. But how can we now get access to this DOM element, this JSX, but really ultimately DOM element? What you might think we want to do, and actually I don't think I've even ever tried this, because spoilers, this is not what you want to do. Let's see if this will work. Input field, get element by ID, title, and input field dot value. Okay, cool. So it does work, but there's really no need to do that. There's a much simpler way. So all change events, input events, click events, in fact, probably all events, their handlers receive the event property, event parameter. This is just like the event you're used to in vanilla JavaScript. It's literally the same. Again, that's kind of a lie. It's a little bit different, but it is more or less the same. So event.target is the element that triggered this event. Event.target.value is going to be the current value of that input field, because that's the input field that triggered the event. So to our user or in the console, it's basically the same as what we just had, but we can now use this function for multiple different input fields, all with different IDs. They are all using this function, and they're all acting on the target, the element that triggered the event, rather than query selecting a specific element. It's much nicer to write a pure function that just deals with the arguments it receives. So now we have event target value. That is in fact what we want to use, and we want to call set title. So now as soon as I start typing, this crackers is going to disappear, and it's going to become hello, welcome to the egg site That was worth me getting losing my train of thought for, because we have that sort of slightly silly ternary in here. If the length of the title that the user has typed in is actually 0, then display the default title, otherwise display the title. So as soon as we start typing, even if it's a space, so it's not really ideal, we want to strip the white space, even if it's a space, it's going to display what the user has just typed in. So 744, I think again no one's going to offer up any suggestions, so we can add a search to the recipe list. We're going to do the same thing.
I was just about to say that as well.
Good. So
That was it. I'm lying.
So we've got our checkbox that is applying one kind of filter. We now want a text field that has a user's search term that is going to apply that as a filter. So we're going to have another label, not that, search term, and type text doesn't really, or actually type search might be a thing. Let's see if search is a thing. Form, search field, yeah, it is. I don't really think it does anything special. The main difference between a text field and a search field is how the browser styles its appearance. Search fields are rendered with rounded corners. Really? As opposed to text? Really? Is the first one in this a text field? Weird. Okay. And they might read search as a default. So when you are building your pages, input types make it so much nicer for your users. If you've ever been on a website where you have to type in a phone number or any kind of number and it comes up as the just like QWERTY keyboard, as the letter keyboard, and not as this number keyboard, you now know that it's literally just like 4 characters for someone to change that, and it honestly makes such a big difference. Stuff like the URL as well, it will on Android, I'm assuming iOS does the same. On Android it will show like a little slash. Email will, I don't know, email shows a little @ and a .com and stuff. Yeah, it's such a big user experience improvement and it's so little effort to do. Okay, so input type search on change this dot handle search change. So handle search change is going to be a function, and this is an event handler. So it's going to receive an event. This dot set state search term event target value. We don't need to update the state object in here in the file, but it's really good practice, and it's really quite bad practice to not set it in here. So if we didn't, search term, when we access it down here, it's just going to be undefined. So like it's fine. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to break or anything. But having a fully written out state object in your code, when someone else opens this file, they pretty much just have to look at this and then the render function to kind of work out what's going on. So it's certainly just good practice, but it's really it's the best type of good practice. Like, you definitely should be adding all of the pieces of state to this default state object. Okay, handle search change, event target value. Let's see if that works. Search term. Go to our components, recipe list, see the state. Search term is that. We are going to change it in the state. Sausages. And it hasn't updated here. So, in fact, it might. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. There used to be a warning in the console about doing this. In fact, I think it's the other way around. So I've added the change handler, but I haven't added the value of this input field that is going to be based on this.state.search term. So this is the two-way binding. So if you remember, it was a little bit throwaway on a slide on Tuesday. There's one-way binding and there's two-way binding. One-way binding would be like this. So this input field always displays what's in the search term, but changing the input field isn't going to change what's stored. Two-way binding, we always have a value and we always have an on change. It is referred to as a controlled component. That component is entirely controlled by the state. I don't know, it's going to make a sort of communism joke, but I can't be bothered. So we should now be able to update this. Cheese, I don't know, search term, that's updating in our state, and vice versa. Eggs, everything's going to come up with eggs. And we have eggs in our state, and we have eggs in this search field. Now we need to apply the filter. Remember, we don't apply the filter at the same point at which we store that search term. We apply the filter just before we render. So search matched recipes, we can just apply filters one after the other. So what we're going to do is this.state.recipes.filter recipe.title.includes this.state.search term. So recipe.title is a string. Does it include this.state.search term? If so, include it in our filtered array of recipes. Then, instead of recipes to display using the entire the entire recipes array, we're then going to only use the search matched recipes. So here we're kind of applying two different filters. Doesn't really matter the order. With certain things it might matter, the order might matter, but with multiple filters the order doesn't matter. So now, cheesy bacon and potato omelette, that sounds delicious, doesn't it? And I'm distracted again. So we have our search term in the state, that is updating. We can clear that. The recipes aren't being removed from state, we're just computing the recipes to display on render. However, the reason I'm typing and is because let's do bacon. There are no recipes. I'm sure we've done this before, so I can't be bothered to wait until someone can answer me. The reason for this is because of case sensitivity. So Canadian bacon omelette, it is a capital B So I've just typed in a capital B with a lowercase b. The title does not include bacon with a lowercase b. Therefore, I mean, maybe you want that, but you probably don't. Therefore, on both those strings, you want to normalize it. And normalizing is just kind of returning to the same sort of state. That's kind of confusing explanation right now. But we want to normalize it by saying, okay, a lowercase version of the title and a lowercase version of the search term. So now I can have bacon in all caps, and it's going to match bacon in mixed case. Bacon in all lowercase is going to match, and again, bacon with mixed is going to match. I think that's probably everything. What we could do, because I'm a pedant, is replace omelette spelled. Is that even the American way? Like, who spells it like that? Omelette. I'm sure that's the British way of. And French. It's the French way, isn't it? Yeah. So now, before we render, we're actually changing the spelling of American omelette to French omelette. Okay. 2 questions. Any questions or even suggestions of stuff to chuck on this? We didn't really do a combination, so I've just typed in H, so we've got cheesy bacon, shrimp and Spanish. There's the H, but if I only want a simple one, it will get rid of the Spanish omelette. I'm missing zucchini as well because the thumbnail doesn't work. So there's zucchini, Spanish omelette disappears, zucchini moves up there. Spanish omelette. I don't know if anyone is Spanish in this group, but sausage, onions, green pepper, garlic, eggs, salt, black pepper, non-stick cooking spray, butter. I don't think anyone's ever had a Spanish omelette who's looked at that. Let's look at that. Oh, good. They've removed it because it's so blasphemous to the Spanish nation. Okay, that'll do. No one's unmuting. No one's coming up with questions. So I'm going to save my throat and call it a day, unless anyone does have any questions.
No, I think Joe it was the exciting Joe.
The exciting one. You enjoyed that, did you?
Yeah, that didn't help. I think a lot of people switched off.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. Yeah, I do it for myself, really. I know no one out there is listening, so yeah.
No one out there.
Okay, thanks everyone. With Vasil next week, more state and props and stuff. React takes some time to get used to, but